He said oversight was optional. Turns out, federal prison isn't. My name is Elena Brooks. Until 6 weeks ago, I was the chief compliance officer at Crystalline Tech, one of the fastest-growing defense technology companies in the country. I built their compliance infrastructure from scratch over 7 years, ensuring every federal contract we signed met the labyrinthine requirements of government procurement. I was good at my job, too good. As it turns out, that's why Jason Merritt, our new hotshot CEO, decided I had to go. Elena, let's be honest, compliance is just a fancy word for bureaucracy, Jason said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. His office overlooked the San Francisco Bay, a view he'd often gesture toward when making grand proclamations about disrupting the defense sector. Today, he was using it as backdrop for my termination. In the new Crystalline, we move fast, we innovate. We don't have time for endless checklists and redundant approvals. He flashed that perfect smile, the one that had charmed the board and secured his position despite having zero experience in defense contracting. You're just not the right cultural fit anymore. Cultural fit? The corporate equivalent of, it's not you, it's me. Except in this case, it very much was me, specifically my insistence that federal acquisition regulations weren't optional suggestions. Jason, you realize we're not selling photo filters or food delivery apps, right? We make targeting systems for weapons platforms. There's a reason the government requires stringent compliance. I kept my voice level, professional, even as I felt a cold rage building. Cutting corners could cost lives. He waved his hand dismissively. The regulations are outdated, written by dinosaurs who don't understand modern tech development cycles. He slid a manila folder across the desk. HR has prepared your exit package. 6 months severance, standard NDA. Your access credentials will be deactivated by end of day. I didn't touch the folder. And who's taking over compliance? We're distributing those responsibilities across the legal team. He smiled again. More agile that way. Translation: no one would be doing my job. No one would be stopping Jason from signing contracts Crystalline couldn't fulfill, making promises our technology couldn't keep. Not yet. Anyway. I see. I stood up, leaving the folder on his desk. I'll clean out my office. Actually, security will pack your things. Standard procedure. His smile never wavered. We'll have everything shipped to your home address. So that was it. 7 years of building systems, training staff, ensuring Crystalline operated ethically and legally, all dismissed with a wave of a hand and a corporate platitude about cultural fit. As I walked toward the elevator, faces turned away. Word had already spread. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with the dead woman walking. Only David Lynn from IT gave me a small nod of acknowledgement as I passed his cubicle. I should have been devastated. Maybe I was, somewhere deep down. But mostly, I felt something else: certainty. The kind that comes from knowing something nobody else does. Not even Jason Merritt, with his MBA from Stanford and his perfect teeth, knew what I had built into the very foundation of Crystalline's contract approval system. 6 months ago, when rumors first started circulating about board dissatisfaction and a potential leadership change, I'd made a decision. I implemented what I called a legal dead man switch into our federal contract validation system, a final authentication level that required my specific, federally issued biometric signature credential impossible to fake, duplicate, or bypass. I never told anyone about it. It was just an extra layer of security, perfectly legal and in line with federal guidelines for high-security contracts. But it was also my insurance policy. As the elevator doors closed, I allowed myself one small smile. Jason thought he'd erased me from the organization chart. But he'd forgotten one critical thing: I wrote the system. And sooner or later, he'd try to sign a contract without me. That's when my ghost in the machine would speak. The first week of unemployment hit me harder than I expected. I'd never been fired before. My performance reviews had always been stellar. Now I found myself at home on a Tuesday morning, still in pajamas at 11 a.m., scrolling through job listings and finding nothing that matched my expertise. It turned out compliance officer for military technology was a specialized field with limited openings. I tried applying to compliance positions in adjacent industries, pharmaceuticals, finance, even tech startups, but the interviews went nowhere. Word had gotten around. Jason had connections, and the story being whispered was that I was difficult, inflexible, an obstacle to innovation. In Silicon Valley's ecosystem, being labeled anti-innovation was like having leprosy in biblical times. No one wanted to touch me. By week 3, I'd developed a routine. Wake up, apply to jobs I wouldn't get. Pour myself a vodka tonic around 4 in the afternoon, and try not to check my bank account too often. The severance package would keep me afloat for a while, but not indefinitely. Not in the Bay Area, with its obscene housing costs. My apartment felt both claustrophobic and too empty. I decorated it minimally. Work had consumed most of my time and energy. Now those blank walls seemed to mock my empty calendar. I started talking to myself, just to hear a human voice. "You know what's funny, Elena," I said, swirling the ice in my glass. "You spent 7 years making sure other people followed the rules. And what did it get you? Absolutely nothing." But that wasn't entirely true. It had gotten me something: knowledge of exactly how the system worked, where its vulnerabilities lay, and what would happen when Jason inevitably tried to circumvent the protocols I'd put in place. On day 23 of unemployment, I took a part-time job at the Millwood County Library, teaching seniors how to use email and search engines. The pay was negligible, but it got me out of the apartment and talking to actual humans. Plus, there was something oddly satisfying about helping 80-year-old Margaret finally video chat with her grandchildren in Australia. "You're very patient," Margaret told me after our 3rd session. "What did you do before this?" I hesitated. "I worked in compliance for a defense contractor." "Oh my." Her eyes widened behind bifocals. "That sounds important." I smiled. "It was supposed to be." What I didn't tell Margaret was that at night, I still checked the federal procurement data system, public information, available to anyone. I was looking for new contracts awarded to Crystalline, particularly anything over the $10 million threshold that would trigger my authentication requirement. Nothing yet. But it was only a matter of time. Defense contractors lived and died by federal dollars. Jason would need a major contract soon to justify his aggressive growth strategy to the board. On day 39, my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I hadn't seen in weeks. David Lynn. "Hey Elena, quick question about the contract authentication logs. Where would I find the signer verification records?" I stared at the message for a long time. David wasn't in compliance. He was an IT systems administrator, competent, quiet, generally kept to himself. We'd had a cordial professional relationship, nothing more. Why was he asking about authentication logs? Me, why do you need them? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. David internal review. Routine stuff. Nothing routine about it. If they were conducting an internal review of the authentication system, something had triggered it. My heart rate picked up. Me checked the secondary database server. Table is called Auth Verify Master. You'll need admin credentials. David, thanks. Everything okay with you? Me, fine. Why David? No reason. Weird vibe around here lately. Lot of closed-door meetings. Now that was interesting. I considered pushing for more information, but decided against it. Better to let things unfold naturally. Me. Thanks for checking in. Good luck with the review. I set down my phone, my mind racing. They'd hit my authentication barrier. It had started. 2 days later, I was teaching a class on password security to a group of seniors when my phone rang. I normally kept it on silent during sessions, but I'd forgotten to switch it. The caller ID showed a number with a D.C. area code. "I'm sorry, I need to take this." I told the class, "Practice creating strong passwords using the worksheet I gave you." I stepped into the hallway and answered. "Elena Brooks." "Ms. Brooks, this is Special Agent Thomas Reeves with the Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense." His voice was flat, professional. Do you have a moment to speak privately? My pulse quickened. Yes. One moment. I moved further down the hallway, away from the classroom. Go ahead. Ms. Brooks, we're conducting a preliminary investigation into potential irregularities with federal contract approvals at Crystalline Technology. I understand you previously served as their chief compliance officer. Yes, until about 6 weeks ago. And can you confirm that you implemented the current contract validation system used for defense procurement? I did. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. Ms. Brooks, are you familiar with a contract numbered DISA HQ D23 00714 for secure communications infrastructure? I wasn't, but the contract numbering told me it was a Defense Information Systems Agency project awarded in fiscal year 2023. I'm not familiar with that specific contract. It appears to have been initiated after my departure. That's correct. The contract was signed 2 weeks ago, valued at approximately $18.5 million. Another pause. Ms. Brooks, according to our technical team, this contract contains an authentication anomaly. The final approval requires a biometric signature credential that appears to be registered only to you. However, the contract was submitted with what appears to be your authentication. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. That's impossible. Agent Reeves, I haven't signed any contracts since leaving Crystalline. Wenzies, so you're saying you did not provide your authentication credentials for this contract? I did not. I couldn't have, even if I wanted to. My credentials are tied to a physical security key I keep with me and a biometric verification process. They can't be duplicated or transferred. I see. His tone revealed nothing. Would you be willing to provide a statement to that effect and potentially testify if this matter proceeds further? Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Brooks. You'll be hearing from our office again shortly. Please don't discuss this conversation with anyone connected to Crystalline Technology. After we hung up, I returned to the classroom in a daze. The seniors were proudly showing me their new passwords, but I barely registered their accomplishments. It had happened exactly as I'd anticipated. Jason had tried to push through a major contract, but he'd hit the authentication barrier I'd left behind, and he'd tried to fake my signature. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying possible scenarios. Jason discovering the authentication requirement, panicking as the contract deadline approached, deciding to forge my credentials somehow. What had he been thinking? That no one would check, that the system wouldn't notice, or that even if it did, no one would care enough to investigate. He'd been wrong on all counts. And now a DoD Inspector General was involved. At 3 a.m., I got up and made coffee. Then I opened my laptop and navigated to the Crystalline Company website. Jason's face smiled back at me from the leadership page, confident, polished, utterly unaware of what was coming. I clicked through to the news section, the most recent press release, dated just 3 weeks ago. Trumpeted Crystalline Tech awarded 18.5 feet BIRS contract to modernize military communications infrastructure. There it was. The contract Agent Reeves had mentioned. The one Jason had forged my signature to approve. The press release quoted Jason, "This contract represents a vote of confidence in Crystalline's innovative approach to secure communications. We're proud to support our warfighters with cutting-edge technology that doesn't compromise on security." The irony was almost too perfect. Jason, who'd dismissed compliance as bureaucratic red tape, was now facing a federal investigation for bypassing the very security measures he claimed to value. I closed the laptop and sipped my coffee. I hadn't planned for revenge when I built that authentication requirement. I'd simply been doing my job, ensuring that contracts met federal standards. But I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt knowing that Jason's hubris had finally caught up with him. The next morning, I received an email from Agent Reeves with forms to complete for my official statement. As I worked through the detailed questions, memories flooded back the careful design of the authentication system, the multiple layers of verification, the specific implementation of the biometric key tied to my federal identity credential. I'd built it to be bulletproof because that was what the job required. Defense contracts weren't mobile game subscriptions. They involved national security, soldiers' lives, millions in taxpayer dollars. The system needed to be secure, traceable, and accountable. What I hadn't anticipated was that it would become my vindication. As I completed the statement, my phone buzzed again with a text from David. David, place is going crazy. Feds showed up this morning, servers seized, everyone told not to talk to press. Me. What's the official line, David? Routine compliance review. But CIO just got walked out. Jason locked in conference room with lawyers all day. I could picture it, the sudden arrival of federal agents, the panic, the scrambling to understand what had triggered the investigation. And at the center of it all would be Jason, his perfect smile finally fading as he realized the depth of his miscalculation. Me. Any idea what specifically triggered it, David? Something about authentication signatures. System flagged an anomaly. Feds got alerted. Nobody can figure out how to fix it. Keep asking for you. Me. Interesting. David. You knew this would happen, didn't you? I hesitated. Better not to admit anything explicit. Me. I built a good system. It does what it's designed to do. David, well, whatever you did, it's working. Jason looks like he's seen a ghost. I smiled at that. In a way, he had the ghost I'd left in the machine. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched from a distance as the situation at Cristellan unraveled. I didn't need insider information anymore. It was all becoming public. The local tech blog broke the story first. Federal investigation targets Cristellan Tech over contract irregularities. Then came the business press. Cristellan shares plummet amid DoD probe. Finally, the mainstream media picked it up. Defense contractor accused of falsifying federal documents. None of the stories mentioned me specifically, but they all referenced authentication issues and signature verification discrepancies. Reading between the lines, it was clear what had happened. Jason had tried to push through the DISA contract without proper approval, had encountered my authentication requirement, and had attempted to forge or bypass it. What he hadn't realized, what no one at Cristellan had known, was that the system wasn't just checking a digital signature. It was verifying my specific federally issued credentials, tied to my biometric data and physical security key. It was, by design, impossible to fake. 3 weeks after Agent Reeves's initial call, I received a formal request to appear at the DoD Inspector General's office in Washington, D.C. The government would cover my travel expenses. I was not under investigation, the letter emphasized, but my testimony was crucial to their ongoing case. As I packed for the trip, I received another text from David. David, just heard. Jason's been suspended, board-appointed interim CEO. Places in chaos. Me. That was fast. David, feds don't mess around with procurement fraud. Word is they found other irregularities once they started digging. That didn't surprise me. If Jason was willing to forge signatures, what else had he been willing to do? Cut corners on testing misrepresent capabilities. The possibilities were endless and frightening, especially for a company building technology for warfighters. The following Monday, I found myself in a sterile conference room in a nondescript government building in Crystal City, Virginia. Across the table sat Agent Reeves, now joined by 2 other individuals, a woman introduced as Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Suarez, and a man in uniform identified as Colonel James Harwick from the Defense Contract Management Agency. Thank you for coming, Ms. Brooks. Agent Reeves began. We appreciate your cooperation in this matter. I nodded. Happy to help. Let's start with the authentication system you implemented at Cristellan. He continued. Could you explain, in layman's terms, how it works and why it would be impossible for anyone else to use your credentials? I took a deep breath. The system has multiple layers of verification for contracts above certain thresholds. For particularly sensitive or high-value contracts, anything over $10 million or involving certain classified technologies, it requires an additional level of authentication from the Chief Compliance Officer. And that would have been you, during your tenure. AUSA Suarez interjected. Yes. The authentication requires 3 factors: something you have, something you know, and something you are. I placed my federal PIV card on the table. This is a personal identity verification card issued by the federal government. It contains a cryptographic certificate tied specifically to me. That's the something you have component. The something you know is a complex passphrase, and the something you are is a biometric verification specifically. A fingerprint scan that must match the template stored on the PIV card itself. Colonel Harwick leaned forward. And this system was approved as part of Cristellan's security protocols for handling federal contracts. Yes, it actually exceeds the minimum requirements. I implemented it because Cristellan deals with sensitive defense technology. I wanted to ensure absolute accountability. Agent Reeves slid a document across the table. This is the contract in question. According to our forensic analysis, it was approved using credentials that appear to be yours. 2 weeks after your employment was terminated. I examined the document. Sure enough, there was an approval stamp with my digital identifier. This is a forgery. I never approved this contract. Could someone else have used your PIV card? Perhaps you left it behind. I shook my head. No. I've had my PIV card with me at all times. And even if someone had the physical card, they would still need my fingerprint and passphrase. Could the system have been modified to bypass these requirements? AUSA Suarez asked. Theoretically. With enough time and expertise, perhaps. But it would leave evidence. The authentication logs would show the modification. They do, Agent Reeves confirmed. Our cyber team found attempts to alter the authentication database. They were sophisticated but ultimately traceable. Do you have any idea who would have attempted this? Colonel Harwick asked. I chose my words carefully. I can't speculate on who specifically might have done this. But after my termination, the compliance functions were supposedly distributed among the legal team, under the ultimate authority of the CEO, Jason Merritt. AUSA. Suarez made a note. And was Mr. Merritt aware of this authentication requirement? I don't know. It was documented in our compliance protocols, but I paused. Mr. Merritt often expressed the view that compliance procedures were unnecessary bureaucracy. He might not have familiarized himself with all the details. One more question, Ms. Brooks. Agent Reeves said, in your professional opinion, why would someone attempt to bypass this authentication rather than simply implementing a new, legitimate verification process? The answer was obvious, but I spelled it out anyway. Time. Changing the system properly would require board approval, documentation, testing, and certification. It could take months. If someone was in a hurry to get a contract approved, they might take shortcuts. Colonel Harwick finished. Yes, especially if they didn't respect the importance of compliance in the first place. The interview continued for another 2 hours as we delved into technical details of the system, my implementation, and the specific anomalies found in the fraudulent approval. By the end, it was clear that they had built a substantial case. As we concluded, AUSA Suarez shook my hand. Your testimony has been extremely helpful, Ms. Brooks. We'll likely need you again as this case progresses. I'll be available, I assured her. As I gathered my things, Agent Reeves walked me to the elevator. Off the record, Ms. Brooks, that was quite a system you built. Almost as if you anticipated someone might try to bypass it someday. I met his gaze evenly. I just did my job. Agent Reeves, I made sure the system protected the integrity of the process, regardless of who was in charge. He nodded slowly. Well, it certainly did that. As I flew back to San Francisco that evening, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly. A touch of schadenfreude at Jason's downfall. But also sadness for the company I'd helped build, now facing public scandal and potential debarment from government contracts. I hadn't wanted this outcome. I'd simply wanted to ensure that whoever followed me would have to maintain the standards I'd established. If Jason had respected the process, if he'd bothered to understand it instead of dismissing it as unnecessary bureaucracy, none of this would have happened. But he hadn't. And now he was facing the consequences. The next morning, I awoke to breaking news. Cristellan CEO Jason Merritt placed on administrative leave amid federal fraud investigation. The article detailed allegations of falsified federal documents and procurement irregularities. It quoted a company spokesperson. Cristellan takes these allegations extremely seriously and is cooperating fully with federal authorities. The board has appointed Chief Operating Officer Marianne Chen as interim CEO while the investigation continues. Marianne Chen, I knew her well, a serious, detail-oriented executive who had always understood the importance of compliance. If anyone could right the ship, it would be her. Later that day, my phone rang. Another D.C. area code, but not one I recognized. Elena Brooks. Ms. Brooks, this is Marianne Chen. I nearly dropped the phone. Marianne, congratulations on the interim CEO position. Thank you, though I can't say I'm thrilled about the circumstances. Her voice was tight, controlled. I'm calling because we need your help. My help? The authentication system. We have several pending contracts that need approval, but we can't process them because of the biometric verification requirement. I allowed myself a small smile. I see. And what exactly are you asking me to do? We need you to help us transition to a new authentication protocol, one that doesn't depend on your personal credentials. That would require me to come back to Cristellan in some capacity. There was a pause. Yes, I'm prepared to offer you a consulting contract to facilitate this transition, and another pause. I believe the board would be open to discussing a more permanent arrangement afterward. You want to rehire me? Elena, let's be frank. Jason made a catastrophic error in judgment, both in firing you and in what followed. The board now understands the value of strong compliance leadership. We need someone who knows our systems inside and out, and who has the integrity to stand firm even when faced with pressure from above. I considered her offer. Part of me wanted to savor the moment, to make her beg a little, but that would be petty and ultimately counterproductive. I'll need some assurances, I said finally. Complete autonomy for the compliance department, direct reporting line to the board, not just the CEO, and a seat on the executive leadership team. I think those terms are reasonable, given the circumstances. When can you start? I'll need to see the consulting contract first. Have your legal team draft something and send it over. Of course, and Elena? For what it's worth, I always thought Jason was making a terrible mistake letting you go. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long while, processing what had just happened. I'd gone from unemployed and seemingly unemployable to having leverage over a multi-billion-dollar company in the span of a few weeks. All because I'd built a system that did exactly what it was supposed to do, ensure accountability. The following day, a courier delivered a consulting agreement from Cristellan. The terms were generous $500 per hour, minimum 20 hours per week, for up to 3 months. More importantly, it included a clause about exploring permanent employment opportunities upon successful completion of the consulting engagement. I signed it, but added a handwritten note, contingent upon full cooperation with federal investigators regarding contract DISA HQ D23007 San Puari 4. 2 days later, I walked back into Cristellan headquarters. The atmosphere was noticeably different, subdued, tense. Security issued me a temporary badge with restricted access. As I made my way to the executive floor, I noticed people staring, whispering. Marianne met me in the conference room adjacent to what used to be Jason's office. She looked tired, but determined. Thank you for coming in, Elena. I appreciate your willingness to help us through this situation. I'm not doing it for Jason, I said plainly. I know. You're doing it for the company and for the integrity of the process. She gestured to the chair across from her. Before we begin, I should inform you that Jason has officially resigned. The board accepted his resignation yesterday. I nodded, unsurprised. And the federal investigation. Ongoing, the U.S. Attorney's Office has indicated they're pursuing charges related to falsification of federal documents and potentially wire fraud. Serious charges. Very. And there's more. She slid a folder across the table. Our internal audit has discovered other irregularities. Contracts signed without proper testing verification. Capabilities misrepresented to government customers. It appears that after your departure, several corners were cut. I opened the folder and skimmed the contents. It was worse than I'd imagined. Jason hadn't just forged my signature. He'd systematically dismantled key compliance safeguards throughout the organization. How bad is the damage? We're still assessing. Best case scenario. We face substantial fines and a temporary suspension from new federal contracts. Worst case. She didn't finish the thought. Worst case was debarment, a death sentence for a company that relied primarily on government customers. I'll need full access to all contracts signed in the last 6 weeks, I said. And a team of at least 3 people to help with the audit. You'll have whatever resources you need. The board has made compliance our top priority. I couldn't help but smile at that. Funny how that works. Marianne didn't smile back. We should have listened to you from the beginning. Elena, I should have pushed back harder when Jason proposed eliminating your position. I'm sorry. Her apology seemed genuine, which I appreciated, but it didn't change what had happened. Let's focus on fixing the mess now, I said, starting with the authentication system. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with Cristellon's IT and legal teams to implement a new authentication protocol, one that maintained the rigorous security standards I'd established, but distributed the verification authority across multiple executives, with appropriate checks and balances. At the same time, I helped the company prepare for the inevitable consequences of Jason's actions. We conducted a thorough internal investigation, documenting every irregularity and reporting them proactively to federal authorities. We developed remediation plans for affected contracts and reached out to government customers with full transparency about the situation. It was exhausting, high-pressure work, but also deeply satisfying. I was rebuilding what Jason had tried to tear down, and this time with the full support of company leadership. 3 months after my return to Cristellon, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced charges against Jason Merritt, 18 counts of falsifying federal documents, wire fraud, and making false statements to government officials. If convicted on all counts, he faced up to 20 years in prison. The company itself entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, a kind of corporate probation. Cristellon would pay a $25 million fine, submit to independent compliance monitoring for 3 years, and implement enhanced ethics and compliance training for all executives. It was a heavy price, but it allowed the company to continue operations and maintain its eligibility for government contracts. The day after the settlement was announced, Marianne called me into her office, the same office where Jason had fired me 6 months earlier. The board met yesterday, she said without preamble. They've removed interim from my title. I'm officially CEO now. Congratulations, I said, and meant it. Marianne had worked tirelessly to save the company from Jason's recklessness. Thank you. And my first official act as permanent CEO is to offer you this. She handed me an envelope. Inside was an employment contract for the position of Executive Vice President and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. The salary was nearly double what I'd been making before, with substantial equity grants and a guaranteed seat on the executive leadership team. Direct reporting line to the board, Marianne added. Complete departmental autonomy. And I've added something else. You'll oversee a new ethics and compliance committee with representatives from every division. We're making compliance part of our core identity going forward. I studied the contract carefully. It was everything I'd asked for, and more. This is very generous. It's what you deserve. And frankly, it's what the company needs. She leaned forward. Elena, you were right all along. Compliance isn't bureaucracy. It's the foundation of everything we do. Without integrity in our processes, nothing else matters. I signed the contract on the spot. As I walked out of her office, now my colleague rather than my superior, I felt a sense of closure. The system I'd built had worked exactly as intended. It had ensured accountability when human judgment failed. It had protected the integrity of the process even when those in charge tried to circumvent it. Jason had laughed at the need for a compliance officer, dismissing it as unnecessary bureaucracy. Now he was facing federal charges while I returned to the company with expanded authority and a renewed mandate. The final irony came 6 months later, when I was called to testify at Jason's trial. As I took the stand and swore to tell the truth, I caught his eye from the defendant's table. The confident smile was gone, replaced by a haunted look of someone who finally understood the cost of his arrogance. The prosecutor asked me to explain the authentication system I'd implemented and why it would have been impossible to forge. The system was designed with multiple redundancies, I explained to the jury, but the final authentication level required a specific type of cryptographic handshake that could only be generated by my personal federal credential, which includes biometric verification. And would Mr. Merritt have been able to duplicate or forge this authentication? I looked directly at Jason as I answered, no, he couldn't have. Those 4 words seemed to echo in the courtroom. He couldn't have, not wouldn't have, or shouldn't have, but couldn't have. I had built a system that even the CEO couldn't override or circumvent. Jason was convicted on 14 of the 18 counts. The judge, citing the national security implications of falsifying defense contract documents, sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison. I didn't attend the sentencing. By then, I was too busy rebuilding Crystallon's compliance infrastructure, training a new generation of employees who understood that rules weren't obstacles to innovation, but the framework that made innovation meaningful. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I wonder if I should feel guilty about what happened to Jason. After all, I had deliberately built a system that would catch anyone trying to bypass proper protocols. I had anticipated that someone might try to circumvent compliance requirements, and I had created a trap for them, a trap that ultimately caught the CEO himself. But then I remember what compliance is really about. It's not about bureaucracy or red tape or slowing things down. It's about integrity. It's about keeping promises. It's about ensuring that when Crystallon tells the government, our technology does X, it actually does X, because soldiers' lives depend on it. Jason had dismissed all that as unnecessary. He'd thought rules were for other people, that his cleverness exempted him from the systems designed to ensure accountability. He'd been wrong. The authentication requirement I'd built hadn't been designed specifically to catch Jason. It had been designed to catch anyone who tried to bypass proper protocols. That it happened to be the CEO who fell into the trap was his choice, not mine. A year after Jason's conviction, Crystallon had fully recovered from the scandal. Under Marianne's leadership and with my expanded compliance department, we'd rebuilt our reputation with government customers. We'd even won several major new contracts, each one approved through the new authentication system. I designed a system that distributed authority appropriately while maintaining rigorous security standards. The story became something of a legend in defense contracting circles, a cautionary tale about the importance of compliance and the dangers of cutting corners. I occasionally get invited to speak at industry conferences about ethics and compliance in defense procurement. I never mention Jason by name in these talks, but everyone knows who I'm referring to when I discuss executives who prioritize speed over integrity. One day, about 18 months after my return to Crystallon, I received an unexpected visitor in my office. David Lynn, the IT administrator who had texted me during the initial investigation, stopped by during lunch. "Got a minute?" he asked, hovering in my doorway. "Of course, come in." He sat across from me, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I've been meaning to ask you something for a long time, but never found the right moment." "What's that?" "The authentication system. The one Jason tried to bypass." He leaned forward. "You built it knowing someone would try to forge your signature one day, didn't you?" I considered denying it, but David deserved better. He'd been the only one to reach out to me during my unemployment, the only one who seemed to recognize the injustice of my firing. I built it to ensure accountability, I said carefully, to make sure that whoever followed me would have to maintain the standards I'd established. So you didn't specifically target Jason? No, I implemented the system 6 months before he even became CEO, when the first rumors of leadership changes started circulating. I met his gaze. But I did anticipate that whoever took over might try to bypass compliance protocols. The system was designed to prevent that, regardless of who was in charge. David nodded slowly. It was brilliant, like a legal trap with no downside. If no one ever tried to forge your signature, no harm done. But if someone did, they'd be caught, I finished. And they'd have only themselves to blame. Exactly. He stood up. Well, I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're back. The place runs better with you here. After he left, I turned to look out my office window. From this height, I could see across the San Francisco Bay, just as Jason once had from his office. But unlike Jason, I didn't see it as a backdrop for grand visions of disruption and innovation at all costs. I saw it as a reminder of interconnectedness, how every decision we make ripples outward, affecting countless others. Compliance wasn't about saying no to innovation. It was about ensuring that innovation happened within a framework of integrity and accountability. Jason had never understood that. He'd seen rules as obstacles to be overcome, regulations as burdensome restrictions on his freedom of action. He'd failed to recognize that in a field like defense technology. Those rules existed for a reason: to protect national security, to save lives, to ensure that taxpayer dollars were spent appropriately. His mistake hadn't been firing me. His mistake had been thinking he could bypass the systems I'd built, that his authority as CEO somehow exempted him from the requirements that applied to everyone else. He'd been wrong. And that signature, he couldn't fake the one that required my specific, federally issued biometric credential, had exposed him. As I turned back to my desk, I noticed a new email from Marianne. The subject line read, "Board presentation on compliance infrastructure, need your input." I smiled as I opened it. How things had changed. From being fired as an obstacle to innovation to being consulted by the board on compliance infrastructure, the system had worked exactly as designed. Not just the authentication system, but the larger system of accountability and rule of law that governed federal contracting. Jason had thought he was above it all. The system had proven him wrong. And I. Elena Brooks, the compliance officer he'd dismissed as unnecessary, had been the architect of his downfall. Not out of vengeance, not out of spite, but out of a commitment to integrity and accountability that Jason had never understood or valued. In the end, that was the true lesson of what had happened at Cristellan. Compliance wasn't optional. Oversight wasn't bureaucracy. And rules existed for a reason. Jason had learned that lesson the hard way. I hoped others would learn it from his example, rather than having to experience it firsthand. Because in my field, cutting corners didn't just risk profits or reputation, it risked national security, it risked lives, it risked everything that mattered, and no signature forged or otherwise was worth that price.